Hello, friends. This is Andrew Sweeney from Parallax Academy. This is just a quick reminder to subscribe and like our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to keep abreast of all of our activities. And if you want to get more involved, Parallax Academy has a membership program, coaching and mentorship, as well as several new courses and study groups. Come and join our convivial hub and network with some of the best thinkers, movers, and visionaries in the world today. And please consider contributing by becoming a patron or making a donation. Join us to help rebuild spirituality, rethink philosophy, and reimagine culture. The links to all of our activities are in the description below. Now, enjoy.
That is great hair, man. I'm just saying. I'm a little jealous. I'm working with it, but we're good.
We're all jealous of Anis's hair, yeah.
Shaw. Take us inside, Andrew. It's great to be with you. Love or die.
All right, Dr. Marc Gafni, the ecstatic rabbi and visionary. I'm so happy to talk to you again. And I've just finished reading two of your early books on Kabbalah called Radical Kabbalah, Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Wow.
So I'm kind of drenched in all of this Jewish mysticism. One thing I really appreciated about you is you're able to talk to people in a down to earth way, but you're also able to go really pretty far out there in the mystical realm. You're able to inhabit both worlds. But I had some questions from the book and things that really kind of resonated with me in the book.
So you take it away. I will follow your lead with your permission, Andrew. I want to, brother, just explain to people what those two books are for a second, and then you take us inside. Does that work?
Please.
Okay. So, and Andrew is right. You are right. I live in, as Whitman said, we contain multitudes. Right. And Andrew, you contain multitudes, right? Right. A songwriter, right. An interpreter of tarot cards I see coming in my inbox, right. And, a podcaster, a scholar, right. A practitioner, right. A poet, a convener, right. So we contain multitudes, right. And, one of at the core of everything I'm trying to do is to make this Da Vinci kind of move in this time between worlds and time between stories, and to actually articulate a new story of value. My friend Ken Wilber made a kind of an attempt like this with integral theory, which was important. It was not so much a story, though it was a scaffolding for stories. All right. And I've tried to kind of take the next step and enter into an actual story, right, of value rooted in first principles and first values. That's the context. We call it CosmoErotic Humanism, but CosmoErotic Humanism, which is basically, and my friend Zach is within earshot, actually, in the building. Zach is just like Elvis is in the building, right? Zach is in the building. We live here in at the center in Vermont. There's a set of about 10, 12 books, which are the early writings that formed some of our thinking on the way to CosmoErotic Humanism. And our mutual colleague, Andrew Lehman Pascal, who was just sat at the house actually 2 weeks ago. He was on the porch here, chatting and eating a lot of cheese, actually. Right. KK said to him, Lehman, I think you got to take the cheese with you. So he did, right? A whole thing of cheese and nuts with Brendan, I think Brendan Dempsey. So Lehman's doing a series of podcasts with me on the 10 early books that lead to CosmoErotic Humanism. But by far the most important two, right, which are the least read, right, are the ones that, Andrew, you're referring to. Zach found me because Ken Wilber had read a 1,500 page version of Radical Kabbalah. He read it in 3 days. He was emailing me all through 3 days, and he annotated the whole thing. And that copy was floating around Boulder, where we're kind of the young kids of Integral. This was 15, 20 years ago. We're reading it, and Zach read it then, right? That's actually how Zach and I first made contact. Christina Kincaid, right, read it, cover to cover, footnote by footnote. Many people here right? Have read pieces of it, but it's actually, as you say, Andrew, it's actually quite a serious work of kind of, scholarship, which covers, 1,500 years of history and thousands of Aramaic sources. But it's actually a disguise for a kind of revolutionary manifesto. So it's a revolutionary manifesto disguised as scholarship. My thesis advisor is the #1 scholar of Kabbalah in the world today, Moshe Idel, who basically said to me, Andrew, he said, Mark, I think your thought's important. Go get a doctorate at Oxford or Harvard. I said, Moshe, Oxford and Harvard are kind of fields of mediocrity, right? Why would I, it's just an insult to intelligence to go there. And Moshe said, Mark, do me a favor, just go get a doctorate at Oxford. You need to do that. He said, I'll be your thesis advisor, do what you want. So he was, and that's how that got started. And I'm going to shut up in 1 second. I just want to add one thing, which is nothing written in that book is obvious. Meaning this thinker, right, who is in the lineage of Solomon, named Mordechai Leiner, actually hid all of his thought. And that's the important thing I want to say here. Everything was hidden. So he looks like a classical Hasidic thinker in the 19th century, in the tradition of the Baal Shem Tov, right, the founder of Hasidism. And at some point, Andrew, and I spent literally 10 years teaching him. And then, when Idel said to me, go write a doctorate at Oxford, and I did, and I said, I'm going to write about him, something was wrong. And so I started reading him again. And I found the one library in Oxford that was open 24 hours a day. And I just lived there. And it just wasn't right. And there's a whole scholarship on him of the best scholars in this field in the world. It just wasn't right. And so there's a little thing in Hebrew, Aramaic mystical works where you'll say something and then you'll have in parentheses, right? You'll cite a source. This is actually the original, one of the 2 original books. This is what it looks like. So here, I'll just open it just on whim to a page. And that's my, the original book. So in this, you can see little parentheses where he'll, any place, where is one? Here, just at the bottom here, where my finger is, there's a parenthesis. So he cites a source. So no one ever looks up those sources. You just don't look them up. You're busy, right? So I started looking them up. And Andrew, I realized, why would he cite this source in Aramaic from the 11th century on this when he just said that? That doesn't make any sense. I said, I'm right. Then I looked up another one. Then I looked up another one. Then I looked up another one. And I began to realize he's doing something here. And this is kind of like, think Da Vinci codes. This is the actual Da Vinci codes. And so what he did was he hid his thinking, completely hid it, and he hid it in his annotations. So he would say something which seems to be quite classically Orthodox, but yet there's this hint that he's saying something else, but you can't really, then he cites a source that no one ever looks up because it's just in parentheses. You realize, so I basically wound up with literally 10,000 note cards on the floor of the library in Oxford, in the Bodleian Library. The librarian became anti-Semitic just by me being there, right? It's just like she was ready to kill me, right? And I began to see that there's a pattern and that he actually understands himself to be the direct lineage heir to Solomon. And he traces the wisdom of Solomon directly from Solomon, right, through the lineage, right, to a particular understanding of reality, which is one of the 3 pillars of CosmoErotic Humanism, right? And he's my teacher, right? He's kind of really my teacher. So so it was really an insane Da Vinci Code project. It was, which was completely her grace. I never would have been able to open my eyes to it unless she just kind of showed me the way in. And then it was, after you have kind of some sort of illumination, then you have, an insane project of scholarship. And when I look at that book, I have no idea how to do it again. It was such an insane project. There's no way I could do it again, but it's actually one of the absolute cores. And my last sentence, and thank you for being patient, right, with this long run on paragraph, part of my confidence comes from, I'm often, just for people on the call, I'm often thought to be arrogant, right? And I'm actually not. I'm not arrogant. I'm confident, right? Meaning, and I'm confident because I'm not alone. This is not, and by the way, anyone may just mute yourself because we're hearing someone on the thing, because this is not, I came up with an idea, but I'm actually joined by the great masters of all the great traditions. And I'm regularly talking. Last 2 weeks, Andrew, I spent with Abhinavagupta, deep into the late night, deep in a Abhinavagupta text, who's the, founding sage of Kashmir Shaivism. I've been just lost in Abhinavagupta these last 2 weeks and relating him. So we have friends on the path. Right. And when you have a direct sense of realization, and then you've actually entered deeply with the most wondrous, subtle, and speculative mind hearts, and they found a way similar to yours, and then we all find each other, then you're not arrogant and you're humble before the mysteries, and you know that you don't know so much. Right? There's so much where just the answer is I don't know. And the mystery, we never pierce ultimately the mystery, and yet we have confidence. Yet there's a sense of confidence. So that's just a framework for the conversation. Thank you for bearing with me. And I will now follow you the entire rest of the dialogue. Thank you.
That's wonderful. That's great. And I think when you were saying that, I was considering the fact that in the past few years, I've been on a journey discovering, Jewish texts, and I'm not Jewish. So I find the need to want to be friends with people in different traditions in order to enrich my own practice or my own path. And the wisdom of Solomon particularly attracts me because it's so different than what we think of as being, the pillars of the Abrahamic tradition and all that. So I've been, how do I say this? I've been talking to a lot of people in occult traditions and in pagan traditions, and the biggest, let's say, critique they have against Abrahamic traditions is you're leaving out this whole world of sensuality, of sexuality, of beauty in this, in this whole let's say this more codified type of religion, and it seems like your work is trying to unveil that. So yeah, perhaps if I could just ask you about what is the wisdom of Solomon, and we could start there.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, I want to be with full transparency. First off, I don't use the word Jewish a lot, and not because I'm anti-Semitic, right, but because I don't quite feel it. Jewish is a very ethnic word. And I love bagels and lox and cream cheese on Sunday morning, which is important. To drink a good glass of whiskey, right? We call it schnapps, is important. But ultimately, I call it Hebrew wisdom, which is slightly different, but feel it in your body, it feels a little different, right? So I call it a Hebrew wisdom tradition. So I'm going to refer to it with permission, in that way, number one. Number two, I want to say that it's a living tradition. Okay, and this is really important. My friend Aubrey Marcus just came back from Egypt, and we just did what we call a Holy of Holies. When I study with a person, we call it Holy of Holies, which comes from the Solomon Temple, where the inner sanctum was the Holy of Holies. And, one of the things I said to Ab, he was, is that the Egyptian temples he was visiting, none of those temples are practicing. None of those traditions are alive, right? There's zero connection today between ancient Egyptian practice, and contemporary, right, Egyptian practice. The Hebrew wisdom lineage is living. When I sat with the Dalai Lama in his, bedroom in Dharamsala, one of the things he asked me was, why is this tradition alive? So this is a living tradition. That's really important to note. Toynbee, the great British historian, was completely stymied by it. Why is this tradition alive? Right? They've been exiled from their land. They don't have common language. They don't have common sociology. Everybody hates them, right? They're completely diffused. They have no power. It's 2,000 years later. Why do these people exist? So I just want to just note that this is Solomon's a living tradition, number one. And number two, and I just want to be just with it so people understand how it works. I'm both receiving the tradition in full devotion and recasting it, right? So I'm both recasting it accurately, but not because I found one source, but because we've read tens of thousands and there's a hidden lineage understanding, and then we're weaving it together in something which is also intuited by Solomon, intuited by Luria, by Leiner, by Shimon Bar Yochai, but also a step beyond them, which is what they would want. And that's what the tradition does, right? So for example, when we pray in liturgy, we say, right, Elohim, every morning I say, source of all blessings are you, divine, right? God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. So Luria says, why do you say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? Same God. He says, no, it's not. It is and it's not, right? Each one is a new. So we're both unpacking the lineage of Solomon, and we're doing something which is deeply in lineage, and we're doing something entirely emergent and new at the same time. So just I want to have these things are so subtle. So within that frame, what's the lineage? What's the wisdom of Solomon? So at the core of the wisdom of Solomon is a relationship between Eros and ethics. That's at the very, very core. And it's a very unique relationship, and it rejects kind of classical Western ethical positions, as well as classical kind of pagan erotic traditions, in a certain sense, merges Eros and ethics, merges what I would call the prophet and the pagan. And here's the essence of it. I want to kind of, and I couldn't have said it this way, Andrew, when I wrote Radical Kabbalah. It's getting clearer and clearer. And I've just been sharing this with Zach over the last year. So here's the sentence. This is the core of Solomon, which is Eros and ethics are one. There's no split between the erotic and the ethical. That's a false split. What does that mean? So here's what Eros means. And you and I have talked about this. I'm going to take 2 minutes. I'm going to pass it back to you. So Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, moving towards, seeking, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's an Eros equation. And with our dear friend Zach and I just published a mini book. It's just pre-publication online. We just send it out. It's a 40,000 word book on it's like the tip of the spear of CosmoErotic Humanism. It's the first book of 10, but it actually outlines 18 new value equations. What are 18 first values and first principles? It's crazy exciting. Right? People are like reading it through like drugs. It took us years to do and get it really clear. So one of the interior science equations is the one that I just said. Now stay close, everybody. This is great. And Andrew, brother, here it is. So Eros, so what is Eros? It's radical aliveness, but it's this desire. So there's a throbbing desire in cosmos itself. There's a desire, there's an appetite for deeper contact and greater wholeness. But what does that mean? Deeper contact means contact between parts, relationship. So reality is relationships. And deeper wholeness means right relationship between parts that creates a new wholeness. Now, we just cut through and all of a sudden becomes second simplicity. So what is right relationship between parts? Ethics. That's exactly what ethics is, right? In other words, and again, we just said it so simply that it seems obvious. It took 20 years to formulate it, but it's beautiful. Eros is not just wholeness. Wholeness is relationship between parts. When Jung says, I'd rather be whole than good, Jung's getting lost. There's no split between goodness and wholeness. They cannot be split. Wholeness is the relationship between parts. It's the nature of the erotic or sensual contact between the parts. So if Eros is the desire for deeper contact and the moving towards deeper contact and greater wholeness, then Eros is ethics. Literally. Now, that's shocking. That doesn't mean you don't need to clarify your Eros. So you can have kind of level 1, an explosion of Eros. Level 2, ethics that clarify, right? You got to go from Eros to ethics, let's say from paganism to law, right? Or to science. So you've got early paganism, and then you go to kind of both law, let's say Hebrew wisdom law, or science, right, which emerge in parallel to each other. And then level 3, you reclaim Eros again, in which Eros and ethics are now disclosed to actually be identical. So we're not saying that unclarified impulses, right, which seem to be radical aliveness, right, are ethics. No, we're saying you've got to clarify the impulse. You got to find not just desire, but your deepest heart's desire. When you clarify your deepest desire, right, you clarify your Eros, it is ethics. And any failure to realize that destroys the world, causes ethical breakdown and suffering and abuse of every kind. That's the core of the wisdom of Solomon.
Mhm. So this clarification process is kind of the spiritual practice, right? In a sense.
Yes, and there was a chapter in Radical Kabbalah, I don't know how fast you were reading, brother, called on Berur,
Yes,
B-E-R-R-U-R.
that's the word I was thinking of. Yes.
Right, Berur, which means clarification.
Yeah.
And Berur actually means, and it took me a decade to translate it well. You know, translation's an art, right? And I couldn't get it. Berur is the clarification of desire.
Of desire.
Yeah, it's a clarification of desire, right? And by the way, who got this? Cohen. Cohen, he couldn't articulate it, Leonard Cohen, he couldn't quite articulate it in thought, and he didn't have anywhere in Montreal, right, anyone who was going to share it with him. Montreal was this gorgeous, confused community, and he looked all over the Jewish community. He couldn't quite find it, but he intuited that it was there, and you can feel it in Hallelujah, right? You can feel in all of his songs this very deep relationship to desire beyond shame. Shame doesn't live in Cohen's songs. He actually gets, but he can't quite clarify it. He goes on the Buddhist path where you met him and you guys hung out together a little bit there. But what he was reaching for was this clarification of desire. And that's when David played the secret chord that pleased the Lord. David is, right, the lineage heir to Solomon. David transmits to Solomon, right? And it's not by accident that Solomon is born out of, right, David's attempt to clarify his desire with Bathsheba, right, in Kings 2, chapter 12, which is the topic of Cohen's song, Hallelujah.
Yeah, well, I would have, that's interesting. I don't mean to like disagree with you, but I would have thought that he went through this amazing depression and sadness in his life, and that his song was sort of a confession of his shame. Like a lot of his work was sort of maybe a clarification of the shame rather than something shameless.
It's interesting, right? So this is beautiful. We'll spend a minute on it. We'll go back to Radical Kabbalah, but just without going down this rabbit hole, the way I understood him, and actually we never met. There was a mutual friend of ours that was about to get us together, right when he died, right? And so we never actually had the conversation. But my sense of him is that actually it's not that he didn't have regrets. It's not that he was sociopathic, he was empathic, but he didn't live in a kind of broken shame that my friend B'nai Brown is working so hard to heal, right? In other words, he was in his depression, it's just what it was. But he wasn't shamed by it in that sense where I am bad. Right? He was just very, and when you read him, you know, I don't know, I have his volumes of poetry here. When you read his poetry as well, there's not shame in them. There's brokenness. There's a holy and a broken hallelujah, but it really is. It doesn't matter which you heard, right? There's a blaze of light in every word, right? Even though it all went wrong, you know, I stand before the Lord of song, right? You know, with nothing on my lips, you know, but hallelujah, right? And his lips are hallelujahs, you know, the holy dove is moving too, right? You know, so he's got this very real sense of the brokenness, the fullness, the darkness, the light, but he's not in a kind of broken shame, which becomes narcissistic, right? So he's in confession all the time.
Yeah.
Confession, I would say confession of brokenness, confession of vulnerability, confession of fragility, but not shame in terms of the sense of it. You don't feel shame in his songs. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about Leonard Cohen for hours, actually, because
and we have to have that conversation.
Because towards the end of my life, I met this rabbi that he was close to, who was a neo-Sabbatean, and kind of had the feeling that he kind of came home after his 70s, that he found real peace at that point in his life. In the that he was rare in that sense, because most artists kind of burn out very young, and then there was a lightness about him in the later part of his.
Yes, I think there was coming home, and you know, I won't mention his name, but I had one long conversation with that rabbi, you know, in LA, right, also first name Mordechai, right, and right, so that's great. What we should do is, I'm up for it, you know, at some point, let's actually do one serious afternoon dialogue on Cohen's songs. And kind of the Kabbalistic
I would like to do that. I actually tried to write a book about his songs, so I could. So
let's do that. Let's do a dialogue on Cohen's songs, maybe in the fall, because I've written pages of notes on which I've never shared with anyone on Kabbalistic interpretations of Cohen's songs. So you and I have a date. I'm in.
Wonderful. Okay. So
Yay.
back to the wisdom of Solomon then.
Yes, take us away.
Well, okay. What I'm interested in again, is this integration of paganism and what that means.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, on one hand you have the monotheistic traditions, and on the other hand you have this aliveness in paganism, and then the integration of them in the wisdom of Solomon. So I thought that was a beautiful idea. Maybe you could unpack it a little bit.
That's beautiful. So let's see if we can find this. So in general, there's a thinking which is wrong, which sets up in opposition the prophets and the pagans, right? Where the prophets are thought to represent, the temple and law, right? And, the pagans are, overriding law and are somehow, understood to be in opposition to the Hebrew spirit. In fact, if you look up classical scholarship on the essence of the Hebrew spirit, for example, Yechiel Kaufman, who wrote the great, essay called The History of, Monotheistic Thought of Israel, right? He basically frames the entire Judaic project as radical opposition to paganism, right? So you can imagine when I wrote an article in Tikkun magazine, it was back in 2004, it was a cover story called On the Erotic and the Ethical, and about liberating the sparks of holy paganism. You can imagine how well that went over, okay? And it actually had a lot to do with things that happened a couple of years later. But in any case, that's actually not accurate. What's actually more accurate in the sources, and in Radical Kabbalah too, we cite a lot of these sources and a lot of the texts, is that the prophet is described in the hidden lineage texts as being the incarnation of the Song of Songs, of the lover in the Song of Songs. So, for example, the Bat Melech, the daughter of the king, who's always in all mythology, the erotic goddess, right? The Shekhinah is called the prophet. So the prophet is actually drenched, aroused with divinity. Right? The prophet is, in the language of the Kabbalists, the prophet is Ma'orer Mayim Nukvin. The prophet arouses the feminine waters. So actually the prophet but the prophet is making a claim. And the prophet's claim is there's two experiences in reality. There's wholeness and goodness that we referred to earlier, but that wholeness and goodness can't be separated. And that if you try and split wholeness and goodness in any way, that's the exile of she. And let's stay really close to each other for a second. So what the prophet says is that the way paganism appeared in the world, it's both holy and broken. It's holy in that it actually sees the divine tachat kol eitz ranan, under every leafy tree, in Astarte and Asherah, right? And in fact, the kings of Israel bring the Asherah, the Astarte, into the Holy of Holies in the temple. There's this sense, though, that the prophets have that the pagan movement is splitting wholeness and goodness, and is actually getting lost in pseudo-Dionysian ecstasies that actually become blinded to goodness. Now, this is very, very important, because when you look, for example, at Aztec ceremonies, you look at Inca ceremonies, or you look at actually the Great Mother literature, and my friend Ken, Wilbur, in one of his early books, Up from Eden, does a very good chapter citing these sources on the Great Mother, right, worship. You're ripping out the hearts of living women, quite literally, not figuratively, right? So in other words, there's this sense in paganism in which the experience of the ecstatic, right, and the ostensible wholeness of the ecstatic bypasses, right, the ethical. And for the prophet, the ethical was the irreducible dignity and infinite personhood and value of every individual in reality. And so what the prophet did is, the prophet said, hey, my pagan brothers and sisters, you guys get that there's no place devoid of she. But then you get so lost in the writhing ecstasy of she that you're actually willing to slaughter people, right? Maver beno ubito ba'esh. You pass your children and sacrifice your children in fire. And, my friend Aubrey described to me in a recent conversation how the lineage, his kind of ayahuasca lineage that he was completely enamored by, then he realizes, oh, his teacher tells him, Don Howard, it was his teacher before me, right? It says, oh, but there's this one city, which was a central city, where they're sacrificing children, right? So the prophet says, no. The radical demand of Eros is ethics, and you cannot split the two. And in some sense, and if there's a few key, and Zach caught them, subtle places in radical Kabbalah, where what I try and show is that for Leiner takes all of the erotic ecstasy, right, of the prophet and pagan merged, clarified, and pours it into how I show up in small claims court, right? And there's a whole set of passages of that in radical Kabbalah. In other words, small claims court, ethics, right? The details of a story, the accuracy of a story, the fact base of a story, holding multiple perspectives, but then having a hierarchy of perspectives, because some things are better than other things. I've had this, I've begun to have this discussion, just begun with our friend Layman, where I said to Layman, right, who's awesome, I said, Layman, you're not immoral, my friend, you're a little immoral here, kind of on the details of, story doesn't matter, and it's all kind of, shamanic reweaving. Whoa, slow down, brother, right? Actually, facts matter, stories matter, accuracy in stories matter, justice matters, ethics matter, right? Lying matters, deception matters, misinformation matters, right? That's all part of the legacy of the prophet, and you can't split that two. And when Jung says, I'd rather be whole than good, right, he winds up making broadcasts for the Nazis in 1933. And he talks about the Vogue, and he has this ecstatic moment that's actually been written about, and the Jungians have kind of pretended like it didn't happen, right? But Jung actually splits with Freud for some very deep reasons, right? And we glorify Jung for lots of good reasons. There's a lot to glorify, and there's a fundamental shadow in Jung, which is the split between goodness, right, and wholeness that actually runs like a hidden thread, right, through his thinking, which is tragic. And again, there's many strands to Jung. I'm deeply aware of that, and so you can't actually talk about Jung like you can't talk about Freud. They're multivalent and complex thinkers, and a lot of beauty in Jung, but there's also a pagan moment in Jung, which is why he broadcast for the Nazis. That's a big fucking deal.
Yeah, there was also some recent proof that he was spying on the Nazis. So the story may be more complex. I tend to think, well, I mean, there's this whole business of the shadow, the Jung shadow, and this whole business of the need to go down into the shadow and explore the shadow and explore human darkness and know what it is.
That's different. These are two different things. I want to make this distinction. Let's be very precise.
Sure.
Because and as you know, one of the great weaknesses in New Age thinking, human potential thinking, is that it's sloppy, right? So I want to be very, very precise here. So there's one thing to talk about a dark, Eros that deliberately sacrifices women and children. That's not a movement into the dark Eros of shadow. That is simply dark Eros, which is caught up in its ecstasies. There's a reason why the Nazis were completely enamored with the occult, for example, and the ecstasies of the occult. That's one moment, right? And there's a kind of ecstasy of liberation from ethics. So, for example, in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right, the ring, right, is called, right, remember Gollum says, my precious, right? He calls him my precious, but the ring stands for anti-value. That's what the ring is. The ring is anti-Eros. It's anti-value, right? And so therefore the ring can't be, the quest of the Lord of the Rings is not to find the treasure, it's to destroy the ring. So it's to liberate yourself from the pseudo-Eros or the anti-Eros of anti-value, right? So that's, so paganism freed itself from ethical constraints between unique selves because it was lost in the paroxysms of intoxication, right? Which were often Sauron and Saruman, right? So, and again, paganism was multivalent and varied, and there was many beauties and many different forms of paganism. That's all true, but there was a very clear moment that was challenged by the prophet. So that's one. Now, then there's a second dimension, which you talk about, which is hugely important. And that's the Sabbatian moment, right, in the lineage, Right. And, I've written a draft of an autobiography, and because I was forced to do it by a bunch of friends. And then I was just so embarrassed by it, I just put it away and said, I'm not publishing it. But I wrote it in any case. And I tried to trace my own relationship to Shabtai Tzvi, right, in that. Right. And, and Shabtai Tzvi, right, is about what he calls Yerida. And he's citing a text, an Aramaic text from the Talmud, Aramaic Hebrew, Yerida Tzorech Aliyah, descent for the sake of ascent.
Yeah.
Descent for the sake of ascent. So let's you evoke sexuality, for example. So for example, in the dark eros of sexuality, right? Why does, a little slap in sexuality, right, evoke, right, a kind of, emergent throb of arousal, right? Because it's playing, right, to the play of domination and submission, which is an entire other conversation which we'll have to have after Leonard Cohen, right? But there's a notion of descent for the sake of ascent, or redemption through sin, or sin which is for the sake of the name, Avera Lishma, sin for the sake of the name. That's very powerful.
Yeah, this is the antinomian aspect, right? Which is
this is well.
How could you be redeemed unless you first have sinned, so to speak? But
I would say it's like this, though. It's. I want to be careful with the word antinomian, right? Antinomian is a word that's thrown out around a lot. And by the way, for people listening, antinomian means against nomos, against law, right?
Yeah.
And Leiner's not antinomian. Leiner says that actually, excuse me, for most of your life, in most situations, you're guided by the law, which is a tuning fork, which allows you to calibrate the music of your unique self. And then there are particular moments, kind of a sacred situational ethics, but not a situational ethics because there's no ethos. It's because it's all ethos, and because there's a new revelation of Eros in every minute. There's a newness, there's a new emergent. So the old law can't fully govern this new emergent. And so there's a direct revelation of Eros in this moment, which guides how I incarnate, how I appear. But it's not that I'm always breaking the law. It's not that I'm violating ethos. It's that I live in ethos, but then there's a higher ethos, which is the Judah moment, right? Which in this particular situation, I'm called perhaps to be post-conventional, right? To transgress the convention, but in a very particular context with an enormous amount of care. People think it's easy to be post-conventional. It's much harder. Bob Dylan, when you live outside the law, you've got to be honest.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, so it actually requires a great rigor, right? A great attention, a great devotion, right? To live in this place, which is post-nomian. It's nomian and post-nomian. It's a dialectic between nomos and post-nomos. And that's a place where we're actually writing the new law, right? It's a place where I realize we are the Dharma.
Yeah.
The Dharma is encrypted in our body sacred.
Is there a way in which, in the tantric traditions, you become, in a certain ritual situation, you become intoxicated, or you engage in unconventional sexuality, which used to be called pagan, and then you go back to your life, and that there's a way that you're, by doing that, that's a very healing process, right? Going down into let's say that the forbidden behaviors and doing them and then coming back out, right?
And Andrew, I'd say two things. One is you're audacious, right?
Yeah.
So you're asking kind of a quite direct question from the realm of the esoteric, right? Which is the realm of sacred privacy, right? So I would say like this, just two things. One, there are some things that their nature is to be in the realm of the esoteric, right? And esoteric means, Seter, hidden, but Seter, hidden also means destroy, meaning when you share something which belongs in the private realm and you share it in public, you're destructive simply because it's not understood. In other words, you can shout a secret in public and no one will hear it. Because you have to have a structure of consciousness that allows you to hold it. So is there a place for people who are doing deep, profound work, who are deeply grounded in ethos, in commitment to personhood, right? In commitment to goodness, right? To truth and to beauty. Is there a place to create a container, right? For sexing beyond, right, the narrow realm of the conventional? The answer is absolutely there is. And when we don't allow for that container, we have a world in which most men are adulterers. Just look at the statistics, right? Women's adultery is going way, way up. Women are kind of closing the gap, right? We have a pornographic universe, which links the internet. We have Pornhub that's getting, 80 million hits a day, right? Or whatever, some insane number, because we've actually driven post-conventional Eros underground, and we haven't created a sacred container, right? So that's enormously important. There is a place for dissent for the sake of ascent, right? And
that's that would be integrating the pagan as well. That would be
yes, my friend. Yeah. That would be a moment of integrating the spark of holy paganism into the temple, and it's the place where the pagan and the prophet, begin to come together. So even, let's say a classical couple, okay, a classical, married or, committed couple, or in a committed relationship, there's a place where they can decide, wow, we're going to do our sexing in the way that we usually do it, but every 3 months, we're going to meet for a night, and we're going to actually wear masks, and we're going to find each other in a new way. We're going to actually break a new boundary, but the new boundary is a new boundary of the heart. We're actually going to open up. There's a very beautiful text in the Talmud where Cheruta, right? Cheruta means the free woman. And I discussed this in a book called Lilith, right? Which is on my website. I published it with a co-author in Hebrew, and now we're actually working on it to rewrite it again. But there's an English translation on the website. So there's a text about Cheruta, a woman who's the wife of a great sage who's becoming ascetic, who dresses as a courtesan and seduces her husband, who doesn't realize it's her, right, in the garden. And it's one of the most important stories in the Talmud, right? And so she's called Cheruta, the liberated one, right? And she's an incredibly important figure. And he doesn't know how to hold what happened during that seduction. He doesn't have a container for it. It's an incredibly important story. But often we need to put on a mask in order to seduce our beloved committed partner, right, to a depth that we haven't been able to access. And indeed, Tamar, in chapter 38 of the book of Genesis, and Tamar, right, is the one who seduces Judah. Jacob has 12 sons. In the book of Genesis, 12 is a full house, right? Ishmael has 12 sons, right? And, Abraham comes from a 12-house family, right? And Jacob has 12 sons, right? And in order for Genesis to be successful, you need the 12 to find each other. But it hasn't worked because Joseph has been sold to Egypt, so there's 11. And then Simon has been held by Joseph, now there's 10. It's not working well, right? And then Judah goes down. He leaves, he goes down before Joseph is liberated. Judah goes down and he abandons his kingship. He loses his sense of being Judah. And the entire book of Genesis and the interior hidden wisdom of Solomon, the entire biblical project is about to crash. And this woman, right, named Tamar, and the word Tamar literally means transformation, right, who was married, right, to his first son. And then his first son dies because the way he sexes with her doesn't honor her. And then the second son dies because the way he sexes with her doesn't honor her. He can't see his sons clearly. He doesn't understand who his daughter-in-law is. He's supposed to give his daughter-in-law to the third son, right, Shelah. He refuses to. Tamar realizes that the next in kin after Shelah, right, the brother in Levirate marriage that she's supposed to get is actually Judah. She realizes Judah doesn't see, she can see. So she dresses as a courtesan and she seduces Judah, right? And in that seduction of Judah, Judah is transformed. That is the moment in the Zohar. In that seduction of Judah, in that sexual play, Judah becomes Judah for the first time. And so there's this moment of this ostensible descent, right? Judah goes with a courtesan by the side of the road. She then goes home, right? Then 3 months later, they tell him that his daughter-in-law is pregnant. He says, burn her, because, who could she have possibly slept with, right? She's intended for my third son and I haven't given her. And, she has demanded from him in payment his staff and his signet ring and his cloak, which are actually, according to Genesis 49, symbols of his kingship. They're taking her out to burn her. It's in the last second. She refuses to name Judah because Judah has to claim his own Judahhood. And then she says, right, to the person to whom these belong, and she takes out the staff and the signet ring and the cloak, right, to the one who these belong, I have conceived. There's a moment of silence. Judah can either be silent or speak. And he says, Tzad kamimeni. She's more whole than I. She's more righteous than I. And they birth the Solomon lineage, right, on that night, right, from that child, right? So this notion of the seduction that takes place and the sexual transformation that actually transforms us into our more whole self, right, is part of the lineage of Solomon, but it requires enormous care, enormous attention, easily misunderstood. And it's not light, it's not casual, it's not even easy. It's actually enormously agonizing and enormously ecstatic. But to stand for that possibility is to stand for human transformation.
Yeah. That sounds very much like the tantric lineages, just in general, right? It's not a cheap neo-tantric sort of pleasure dome thing. There's more profound stuff going on.
Yes, and there is. No, I think, you're pointing to something in that sentence, which you did casually, but you were, of course, saying something like you always do, kind of very, very deep, which is across the great traditions, there is a tantric strain. Yeah. So there's a Christian tantra, there's a Kabbalistic tantra, right? There's an Advaitin, tantra, right? There's there's even some, there's Buddhist tantras, there's Kashmir Shaivite, Shakta tantra, right? Now they're not the same, right? They're not the same. They're actually quite distinct from each other. They can't be all thrown into, one pot. But if you would put a gun to my head, which you're a very polite man, so you might not, but if you would ask me, okay, what defines tantric traditions across traditions, I would say three things, right? And this is again, it's in some of the books that are coming out, but it's really important. One is the principle of non-rejection. There's a principle of non-rejection, one that goes across all. Oh,
that's very good. Yeah.
One, the principle of non-rejection. Two, right, a tracing of any phenomena, dynamic, structure, you trace it always back to its root. That's two. The tracing back to its root, that's two. Three, reality is a trickster. There's a trickster quality of reality. So one, right, and it took me, 15 years to try and track the tradition and see what's the common four things. So one is non-rejection. Two is tracing back to the root. Two. Three is reality is a trickster, right? So it's not how it looks, right? And four is, what I would say the distinction between the capital letter and the small letter. So there's small p pleasure, there's capital P pleasure, right? And there's capital P is always part of the story. Small p, there's capital F fuck, there's small f fuck. Those are not the same thing, right? So there's this distinction between, right, the ultimate experience, right? And those four actually express themselves, and we just wrote a book together here, those express themselves across all tantric traditions. And then within that, each one is distinct and has its own quality. Does that make sense, brother?
Sure. I was thinking about, because I read this book called The Red Goddess recently, and it was sort of a cultist pagan book. And it was promoting, let's say, the holy whore, the holy prostitute. And I could see how that could be taken in the wrong way. But there's something about the prostitute or the harlot or the whore who is this non-rejecting principle that you're speaking of.
Well, here's the thing.
And so that's again, I'm being very provocative today. It's just because I think I read this book.
Claire, where did we find this guy? Right? I thought it was like this nice little sweet dialogue with a nice European man. Right? Foster, what are we going to do with him? Right? We don't know. Okay.
I'm just gonna ask you about prostitution and breaking the laws and
breaking the law. But let's talk about the holy courtesan. So first off, there's an entire literature of kind of red goddess books, one of them written by someone who read my work quite carefully and actually deploys quite a bit of it without citing it, which is totally fine, and bless the person, because we bless all non-citers. I was actually talking to a very, very lovely person sitting on my porch, and I was kind of saying that much of the what they call themselves today, meta modern, which is a loose group, a small group of people, are very lovely people, but they actually literally don't cite anything. And I there's kind of an enormous, I read a couple of chapters of it's like, wow, this has all been discussed, this has all been talked about. Why are you guys not citing anything and kind of making it? And so the person said to me, and very innocently said, no, we're rebranding. So I almost fell off my rebranding. I know, there's a lineage tradition. There's reverence. There's how we hold people. This is about Eros and ethics. That's a different conversation. Citing is actually important. One of the things I love about my dear friend Ken is that he cites well, and I try and also in footnotes, right? Now, we're always a unique self-symphony. It's very, very important to cite and to kind of create a larger conversation. But leaving that aside, right? What's the place? And there's an entire nonsense literature that takes place around this kind of ancient courtesan that lived in temples. That's largely mythological, although not entirely. But there is a place for the sacred courtesan. Right, but it's level 3, not level 1. It's not level 1 Eros. It's level 3 Eros after we've clarified through ethics. And I would call it kind of the reclaiming of the sacred intimate. And with Dr. Kincaid, with Christina, we've written in our Phenomenology of Eros an entire section on the need to reclaim the sacred intimate. And there's a doctorate written in Italy, my friend, about, 20, 30 years ago, right? On and her name escapes me right now. The name of the doctorate is, I believe, the Honest Courtesan. It actually became a movie, but it's based on a doctorate, and it's about the place of kind of the courtesan as the one who provokes, right? Who provokes depth and who provokes. And I think there's an enormous place, right, for the sacred intimate, right? In other words, and what we've done is, in a certain sense, now let's go all the way. Since you've kind of opened up provocation, let's go all the way with it just for a second. Right, there's all these stories all over the place of spiritual teachers sleeping with students, right?
Yeah,
it happens all over the place. And the assumption is, right, which is often true, that those are abusive relationships. And of course, they could be abusive because the adult student is abusing the teacher, because they're both powerful adults. And as David, as Meme pointed out in his thing, Oleana, we have adult students who abuse teachers all the time. And it could be teachers who are misusing their power, who are abusing students. That's definitely a real phenomenon in the world. And let's take that as a given. But that's not the whole phenomena, right? The other part of the phenomenon is that there's something that happens, right, in the tantric exchange. And we haven't created a container for the teacher to be a sacred intimate, right, in which the teacher is not performing desire. The teacher's not performing love, because that's actually inauthentic and feels like a violation. But actually, the teacher is actually, whether it's a woman or a man, the teacher's actually loving. The teacher actually is madly loving. And the teacher creates, right, a context, right, with a powerful adult, right? So it's really not, it's not teacher, student, 18, 19, 20. It means a powerful adult man or woman. So let's say an adult man has a teacher who's a woman, right? And this woman actually has this quality of the honest courtesan, and she actually has the capacity to actually, right, give her male student an experience of what I would call CosmoErotic Humanism in person, where you actually feel the CosmoErotic universe alive in you, right? And literally you're exploded, right, into realization. You can actually love your way to enlightenment, right? Then that woman teacher, I think, if she does it with appropriate, boundary, with appropriate ethos, with appropriate depth, is actually being radiant. She's actually being she, right? And I wouldn't castigate that woman as being an abusive woman, right? I would say, wow, right? The goddess, right, in a very, has appeared. Right now, not in every case, not as a blanket. That's why it's post-conventional. It requires attention. It requires discernment. It requires discretion, and we can make mistakes along the way, right? In other words,
it's an art as well. You could say, no, I mean, it has to be an art.
It has to be a very high art form,
yeah.
And Solomon, is reputed in the biblical text. So it's a particular. It's not a back, back alley rumor, it's public rumor, right, to have had 1,000 wives. But what does that mean? What it means is it's not 1,000 wives. We're not counting the wives. That sounds slightly exhausting, right? But it means that Solomon was engaged in an Eros project. And that's how Leiner reads it. In volume 2 of Radical Kabbalah, we talk about that. He's engaged in an Eros project. And he's not just doing, as scholarship reduces it, to political alliances through marriage, which took place all over the ancient and modern world. He's doing something far more subtle. He's actually engaging in Eros. He's the builder of the temple. The temple has the Ark of the Covenant. Above the Ark of the Covenant are the 2 cherubs who are sexually entwined one with the other. So Solomon is incarnating the cherubs, right, in sacred practice. And he's actually with the Queen of Sheba, right? He's with, right, these major, right, powerful women. And he actually, according to our archaeological and textual evidence, actually enacts a series of temples, of goddess temples in Jerusalem, right, which are adjacent and proximate in relationship to the Jerusalem temple, right, in trying to enact kind of what I would call an early version of a new story of value, right, which is cosmocentric, right? So it's an early version of what we're calling CosmoErotic Humanism, and the sacred intimate is central to that. And, a student of mine called me a bunch of years ago and said, I'm thinking about becoming a sacred intimate, and she's a powerful, kind of teacher. And, she decided not to because, her system was very sensitive. And so she decided that's not her way. But I said, full blessing. That's a very, very sacred path. And it's a path of enormous generosity, It's so we need to reclaim the sacred intimate, and the earliest text, right, about, Enkidu, right, and, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? The king is transformed, right, through his encounter with the sacred courtesan. Right? The king meets the sacred courtesan in that original text, and he's transformed into nobility through his encounter, not with New Age sexing with Roman candles, right, with someone chanting in the background. No, he's actually transformed through encounter with the most raw, right, of carnality, which then is traced to its root in that tantric form, which then liberates, right, the king, right, the hero in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to be the noble king. That's the central sacred text, right, which we analyze in the phenomenology of Eros. So what you're raising is enormously important. And if anyone asks me why we talked about it, I will say blame Andrew Sweeney.
Yeah.
There we go. We got that.
You also mentioned in the book that the wisdom, or it was Elena, I'm not sure. I think it was the idea that the wisdom of Solomon was ahead of its time. It wasn't quite ready.
Yes, it wasn't quite ready.
Perhaps implying that are we in a time where we can start to, let's say, metaphorically speaking, rebuild the temple, Mark?
I think that's so. And again, the inquiry is, of course, always more important than the answer. So I'm, following you, and when Neo and Trinity meet, in the Matrix, and Neo wonders in Matrix, the first one, and he wonders, why are we meeting? And she goes and whispers provocatively, sensually in his ear, and she says, we're asking the same question. It's a beautiful moment. And that's a whole mate moment. That's not a soul. It's not a soulmate romantic moment. It's something larger. And so you and I, Andrew, we're asking the same question together. And so I appreciate the depth of the inquiry. And so let me try and say it like this. Steiner, already, who I feel a close affinity towards, although honestly, I've barely read. Zach is responsible in this house for reading Steiner. I'm not. And we split our readings. I kind of stay in kind of the sciences and the pure sciences and the direct lineage texts of the tradition. And Zach reads things like, Peirce and, Steiner. I basically don't read them, but, I have a kind of, general awareness from kind of perusing at 3 a.m. And so Steiner has the sense correctly of this planetary enclosure that's going to happen. The sense of being enclosed in a box, right? The sense of the machine arising and the machine, enclosing us, Ahriman. And he views that as Ahriman is what we would call in the Hebrew wisdom lineage, Sitra Achra, the other side. Yes. It's the wraith, right? It's anti-Eros, right? It's Sauron, right? Who seduces Saruman, right? It's
That's
the two.
Lucifer too, and is it, or is that Luciferian?
There's a Luciferian dimension there, but it's basically it's phallus, right, which is anti-erotic. So, for example, the second Lord of the Rings is called, right, the Two Towers, right, and the Two Towers are two phalluses, and it's the phallus of Sauron and it's the phallus of Saruman. The two phalluses don't even touch each other; they're not even homoerotic, and there's no feminine. Right, and when you look at Lord of the Rings, have you ever seen a woman orc? Right, There's no beautiful women orcs, right, hanging around Lord. There's a reason for that, right? And so it's this anti-value, anti-erotic, eros, which is very, very painful. But what Sauron and Saruman are trying to do is to kind of fulfill that Arman vision of Steiner, which is to enclose the planet, right, in essentially what we would call a Skinner's box. And Zach and I, the second book that's about to come out, we put out the first one as a pre-publication online. It's going to become an actual volume, but volume 2 of that series, there's a number of series coming out. Volume 2 is what we call techno-feudalism, turning the world into a Skinner's box. And Skinner is B.F. Skinner, who was the preeminent psychologist at Harvard for 6 decades. And we actually show in a third volume, right, that actually B.F. Skinner was actually the key hidden figure in the techplex, right? And that his intention, right? Let's look at Benjamin Bratton's work on the planetary stack. His intention actually, right, which is being fulfilled through data science. Skinner didn't have what he called the instruments and methods, but Skinner's intention was to enclose the world in a kind of Skinner's box in order to control it for ostensibly altruistic reasons, to create order. Just like in Star Wars, the first order, right, is to create order. It's always for the sake of order. And that notion of a Skinner's box, that notion of enclosing the world in a planetary stack, right, which Benjamin Bratton's talked about a lot, this planetary stack, which is actually the entire encoded system of the world and the regulation of the world. We're literally beginning now to live inside of a digital box, allowing for the emergence of a kind of digital totalitarianism, right? That is one version of the planetary anti-temple, right? So in other words, we actually have a choice. We're either going to have a planetary anti-temple, right? Or we're going to have a planetary temple. But actually, for the first time, we're in a place where we're being enclosed in space, in a kind of spatial temple. And it's why I say to the people that I love most, right, the people closest to me, don't think about what project's good for your career now. That's not the question. The question is, how do we enact the temple? Right? This is a moment in time where the ethos of this time is not a normal ethos. The ethos of this time is, how do we become a pillar in the new temple? Because we literally have a choice. We're either going to be in a neo-totalitarian Skinner's box, right, Sauron and Saruman, right, which is the planetary stack, which is an ostensibly benevolent totalitarianism. Think China, right, exponentialized, right? Or we're going to actually enact a new vision of value, which allows us to upload value into the techplex, which then creates a planetary temple. And literally the future of trillions of people depends on that question. And to be homo amor, we call homo amor the new human. To be the new human is to actually feel that living in the same way I feel my children next to me. I feel those next generations next to me. And to be actually alive, enlightened today is not to meditate. It's not to do a journey. It's not to do ayahuasca, right? Those are all very nice, but it's to actually have a direct, unbroken access to where we are today, and to actually feel it throbbing, tumescent, dripping in your heart and soul, and to act from that place. That's the holy band today. Cha. Hey, it's a big deal.
Froze for a second. I don't know if that's
no. We were free, right. She was stopping. She was with us, right. It was like we had to stop for a second, right. That's a big deal, right. I mean, I could.
It was too much. There was a glitch in the matrix.
A glitch in the l'chaim.
Yeah. I can I just
please
take it away, Mark. I just want to. That really excites me. That we could define the meaning of our life as that purpose of building the temple. And also knowing the difference. So I just wanted to say that.
No, I can feel you, right? I can now, it's funny, like we can feel, we're just coming inside, right? This is where it, and for me, just if I can just be, and I'll pass it, we'll follow with your next inquiry, but just to be kind of intimate and vulnerable for a second, it's lonely, right? It's lonely. I've been kind of screaming about the meta crisis, which I called back in 2011 or 12, in light of a friend of mine, right? Zach and I wrote an article about the second shock of existence, which is our word for the meta crisis. And you see it, it's happening, and you can't get anyone to pay attention, right? I mean, when I started talking about it, people would say to me, just talk about unique self. Unique self is in response, right, to the second shock of existence, right? It's that, right? Everything is and if you can't see the second shock, you can't see around the corner. It's not because you can't see it, you don't want to see it, because you don't know what to see. You turn away, right? And it's only attention that blooms reality, right? And so, for example, the genuine field of arousal today is the field of arousal between those who feel together, not in a quasi-utopian destructive way, right? Not in a kind of, neo-feudalist evolutionary humanism way, right? Because there's a great history of failed utopias, which are arrogant and which destroy worlds. That's why the prophet and the pagan need to come together. Radical ethics, radical integrity, right? Ethos, right? All a full ethos, full personal responsibilities. And yet the animating context, the eros, the fuck of my life is we have to fuck reality open to its next evolutionary stage, or literally we will actually either end this cycle of life on the planet, the death of humanity, or we'll engage in the death of our humanity, which is what we call these two forms of existential risk. So what's at stake is so real, and it's almost like having it's almost like having a terminal disease. When you have a terminal disease, there's a certain point you can't talk to people about it anymore because nobody wants to talk to you about it. Or let's say you've suffered a major tragedy. I've suffered some relatively significant, life tragedies in terms of false complaints, et cetera. But you can't talk to anyone about the ongoing suffering about it because, no, don't talk to him. He's gonna go there. I'm tired of that, right? So there's certain things when a person gets sick, they just can't talk to people anymore. I have a dear friend who's quite sick now, and she just doesn't want to talk to anyone because no one can actually enter where she is, right? And so there's a sickness in the planet, right? Which is there's a malaise, there's an existential malaise, and literally, even on the day that they had the kind of AI, the declaration on AI signed by a whole bunch of industry leaders for the first time. Right next to in the front pages with AI were all sorts of frivolous stories. It didn't get much attention, and everyone went on with business as usual. So, right, there's nothing more arousing, said Teilhard de Chardin, but we're going to say it in a different way. There's nothing more compelling than the joy of standing with wholemates and looking at a shared vision and closing the exits. Just like you do in a romantic relationship, if you're a homemate, you close the exits. Closing the exits means we're not going anyplace. We're actually really here, right? We're actually not turning away. We're going to face into it, and we're going to be in mad joy, and we're going to love it open, but we're not going to turn away. When you feel that feeling of kind of walking with a pillar, even though the nature of the relationship may change, it may transpose itself, right? But basically we're here together. There's no exits. We close the exits. When we close the exits, we can rest with each other. We can create, a unique self symphony, and we can do unimaginably beautiful things. We have an enormous capacity to change the vector of history. Yes, so like that. And where did Andrew go? He was pinned and then he got unpinned. So I just lost my friend Andrew. Now I'm just looking at myself, which is not pleasant. There he is. Okay. I don't be looking at myself on the screen. There you are.
Now I can only see, now I can see everybody. How do I get back to the, oh, there we go. Okay.
I can see clearly now. Now, are we, Andrew, I was going to check, and I want to make sure that we leave time at the end for the song, because we're going to,
have a problem with
you're doing a Love or Die song today. I just want to make sure we're on for that.
Are you okay, Andrew? You seem to, are you here?
He's here. He's here. He's having a little connectivity problems there.
Yes. Seems like he is having a problem.
You know, Claire, when we're
Half a
having this
second
kind of
here.
conversation, that happens.
Yeah.
I think I'm back and everything is okay
We're
now.
back.
Yeah, you were just talking about how the universe sort of shuts us down, and then I got shut down. So, or
Yeah, no.
that people fall into this state of nobody wants to hear, and that's the last part that I heard.
We turn our attention away.
Oh, now I can't hear you. What's going on here?
That's okay. That's okay. We're good. We'll work it out. Tell me when Andrew's back.
Okay.
Are we back, Andrew? We can hear you, my friend.
I'm back now. I'm back.
We can hear you. We can hear you. We got you.
Yeah. So I got shut out, and then my ear pods turned off, and then I had to, I had to change the earphones, and then I was all.
This is a serious conversation. Of course, that's going to happen, right? I mean, we're the tech, right?
So right.
This is big.
Yes, yes. It's just too much for the internet to handle, basically.
Amen.
Okay.
Yeah. Take us inside, brother. And maybe let's do one more inquiry, and then maybe we can, as we close, I know we're doing about 90 minutes, maybe I would love to kind of just practice with people, do a chant, and maybe then you do give us the Love or Die song today, right? Which we want to hear. We want to hear
Sure.
Andrew kind of taking Leonard Cohen to the next level.
Sure. Well, I guess the inquiry that I've been having, and I've had it since I was speaking to this not to be mentioned rabbi who was a friend of Leonard Cohen's, is the difference. He called it the oral Torah and the law, and then he talked about the oral Torah is direct revelation of what we should do in the world, and then the law would be just the laws, right? And that sometimes direct revelation would make you have to be in the painful position that you have to break the laws of your culture, of your society, in order to do the thing that is purely ethical. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
With total respect and honor, and again, I think I've had only one conversation with this gentleman Mordecai, who was a lovely, lovely man, and
Wild
we do have a
individuals,
couple of mutual friends, Matuka Benjamin in LA. So with total blessings and love, right? I mean, I think he's doing something that often happens, which is homiletics. And I kind of don't do homiletics when you kind of, you kind of take a term and you misuse it. So the oral law does not mean what you just said. Let's be really clear about that, right? And that is not what the oral law means, right? There's which is not and I think Mordecai knows that, right? And the idea that he's talking about is something much closer to what we're talking about in radical Kabbalah. But let me go 2 steps back. So in the lineage of Hebrew wisdom, there are 2 forms of what's called law. There's Torah shebichtav, the written law, which is the canon, the sacred text, the 24 books of the Bible, the prophets, writings, 24 different books in the canon. So that's the written law. And then there is an entire tradition that goes beyond that, right, which is the kind of conversation among the sages, right, about how to read that law, which then creates new law. That's called the oral law, but that oral law is considered to be in the lineage contemporaneous with the written law, meaning that in the lineage, there's 2 streams of revelation. There's the written text, and then there's the lineage tradition, which is also sourced in kind of divine field of inspiration, and that's the oral law. So for example, most of the practices, right, that are done in Hebrew wisdom don't come from the written law, they come from the oral law. And the oral law takes place within the context of sages committed to the law, who then unpack the law. And their authority overrides, as it were, even God. Right? But what it means is they become the new divine voice. So for example, there's an argument in tractate Baba Metzia, is the name of one of the tractates, right? On page 59a, there's an argument between 2 rabbis, 2 sages, Eliezer and Joshua. And Eliezer says, I know I'm right. I know you're wrong. I'm going to bring you proof. I'm going to make the stream flow backwards. A miracle. The stream flows backwards. And Joshua says, I'm really not interested in streams flowing backwards. I don't care, right? I am, right? The sages define the law. He says, I'll uproot a carob tree and I'll have it fly 50 cubits. He uproots a carob tree, it flies 50 cubits. And Joshua says, I'm really not interested in your miracles, right? Just cool it down. He says, I'm going to have the walls of the study hall fall in on us. So they fall in, and then Joshua says, don't fall in. So then they stay poised between falling and not falling in order to honor both sages. Then finally, right, at the fourth stage, Yatsa Batkol, right, a voice comes out, a daughter voice, meaning the Eros from heaven, and says, Halacha Rebbe Lezer. The law is like Rebbe Lezer. Right? And then Kam Rabbi Yeshua al Raglav, Rabbi Yeshua stands on his feet and he says, Lo b'shamayim, it's not in heaven. It's ours, right? We the sages, right? We are the new divine voice. And then after he says that, a voice comes out from heaven, another voice which says, Nitzchuni banai, my children have triumphed over me. But if you read it more carefully, my teacher Leiner wrote, not my children have triumphed. The word is Nitzchuni, which means eternal, meaning my children have made me eternal. Meaning the divine voice is now given over the human voice. That's oral law. So Mordechai may have been referring to that kind of tradition, but it's still a tradition of law, right? Debated among the sages. Leiner is going one step further. Leiner is saying that the individual, not the sage. So in other words, that discussion in the Talmud, the oral laws, right, it's the community of sages. Leiner says the individual who has a direct, unmediated contact with the voice of she, who says to the individual, you live in ethos, and in this particular moment, ethos demands you to transcend the law and to respond to the direct command of she in this moment, right? And you've clarified that voice, right? You're not confused, right? Because disambiguating the integrity of the God voice is a major theme in the interior sciences. Right? Abram gets confused. He thinks God told him to sacrifice his son. That was a mistake, right? In other words, so you got to disambiguate the God voice. When you disambiguate that voice and you've clarified, right, that God voice, then that God voice can speak directly to Andrew Sweeney, not a sage, right, in the community of sages. And Andrew Sweeney at a particular moment in time, in a particular context, can be in that unique situation called to incarnate the Solomon Judah energy, and in that moment transcend the law. Okay, that's what the Judah, that's what the Solomon lineage is saying, which is different than oral law. Does that make sense? The
clarified individual, yeah, I think so. The clarified individual is higher than the legalistic, than what is written, right? His interpretation in that moment has more value than what is written, or what is just the legalistic aspect of the law.
That's right. In other words, there's it's what I called in radical Kabbalah for the first time the democratization of enlightenment, right? In other words, the sage, the notion of the sage or the Buddha is a very elite notion of enlightenment, in which the sage has the ability to access, as it were, the God voice. What Leiner is saying, right, and one of Leiner's translators, Bezalel Edwards, right, who I've never met, kind of mocks the idea that that Leiner is talking about the individual. He says Leiner is only talking about the sage. So with total respect and love and honor to Bezalel, you should learn to read text, young man, right? You actually don't know how to read them, and I've cited dozens of texts in Leiner where he says the exact opposite of that. Leiner does not mean just the sage. That's his entire point, right? Leiner is saying, actually, there's a new democratization of greatness. There's a democratization of enlightenment. There's a democratization of Eros, that I actually do have the capacity to actually access direct zivug, right? Direct erotic union with the Shekhinah. And in particular moments, again, if I'm walking around robbing banks and saying that I had a direct revelation, probably a bad idea. If I'm promiscuous in an inappropriate way, right, whether as a man or a woman, and I'm just kind of blindly promiscuous when I'm saying it's a divine voice, I'm probably making it up, right? It's a very particular, very unique, very beautiful, very clarified voice, right, that requires something. And that requires an enormous depth and an enormous commitment, but it's a clarified voice that comes not to the sage, but to the individual who has a moment of enlightenment where I understand that in this moment, in this place, in this time, this is what she wants. And I respond to her in that way. And that is the ultimate expression of Eros and Shekhinah. Cha.
Okay, that's good, because I wanted to, perhaps the last question or the last thing I want to ask you is about the Shekinah, is about, I understand that word means, and again, I've made a few mistakes here, so I apologize for my butchering.
You're gorgeous.
Of
you get in, you're blowing, you're gorgeous.
But in terms of Shekinah, does it mean the feminine Holy Spirit? Is that correct? And why is that so important? And why is the restoration of the feminine so important in terms of what we've been talking about, in terms of the wisdom of Solomon and the restoration of the temple, the inner temple, and all of that?
Right. No. So this is really beautiful and really important. So there's a major hidden track, clusters and clusters of sources, which I unpack in part 4 of Radical Kabbalah, but especially, Zach's favorite volume and Christina's favorite volume of Radical Kabbalah is actually volume 2. Volume 2 is the unadulterated, straight, it's the real wine. And there's a set of sources there which are called Ti'ufta de Nukba, the radical passion, right, of she, and so let me just say there's 3 things. This is really, really important. In 3 steps. So first, we have to reclaim the dignity of feminine Eros, right? So the feminine has been split off from her fuck. She's been split off from her desire in multiple ways, both her creative desire. So we didn't allow women into the workplace. So we're now overcoming that. We're allowing the creative desire of the feminine, but also from her embodied desire, right? In other words, there was a funny moment in Me Too in which 5 women were being interviewed by the New York Times at the height of the Me Too moment, and all of them were attacking rapacious men in the workplace. And the workplace does have rapacious men, and men do violate with sexual harassment, as sometimes do women as well, right? So there definitely is a real violation. Me Too was coming to correct something that was real. And yet there was a professor, Laura Kipnis, right, from Northwestern, who said, isn't there any woman, right, at any workplace who wanted to have sex? Right? And her point was, and she's a very, very good thinker, her point was, we've split off feminine desire. We've split off feminine agency and desire. So first, there's a need to honor the fullness of the feminine, which means also the fullness of feminine agency and desire. And that's what that book Lilith that I referred to earlier, that I wrote with this partner, right, is about. But that's 1. But 2 is, when we say the emergence of the feminine, we don't actually mean woman. And that's right. We mean woman in part. There's an emergence of the feminine voice. Yes. Right. And that emergence of the feminine needs to happen in the third world. It needs to happen in India and in Pakistan, right, and in China, right, and in Africa, right, where the feminine and the feminine voice and the feminine desire, right, and the feminine creativity is still crushed in so many ways. So we are talking directly about the feminine, right, in that sense, but ultimately there's something deeper, which is there's a quality of the feminine. And that quality of the feminine that lives in every human being, right, we call it the circle quality, right, that quality of the circle Eros of the feminine, that's not about, commodified, measured accomplishment, but it's about, plumbing the immeasurable depths, right? I mean, even just the simplest example, just let's take sexing. There's what I call line sexing and circle sexing. That's part of a larger work on line and circles that our host, that Claire edited and, artistically in a very beautiful way. And it's part of a work we call Beyond He and She, right? But it's the sense circle sexing is, and KK and I, I've been talking about this very deeply in terms of the phenomenology, right? Now, what is line and circle sexing? And KK and Claire and I have this vision, this book that's underway called Beyond He and She. But line sexing is a line drive to orgasm, which lives in both men and women. And if orgasm doesn't happen, we haven't accomplished the goal, right? And circle sexing, right, it's a circle. It's not going anywhere. It's going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And that line sexing and circle sexing is not about the sexual, right? You could be a priest, a Jesuit priest, and be having that conversation, right? It's about how I live in life, right? You know, and there's a beautiful moment. You know, I've been thinking about Lord of the Rings for a while, as you can notice, right? So there's a moment when Arwen is willing to give up her eternity, you know, and kind of stay with the king. She's the queen. She's going to stay with the king, with Aragon, right? And she says, you know, I'd rather have one lifetime with you, right, than eternity. And she's talking about, when she's talking about that lifetime, she's talking about the simple dailiness, you know, living together, talking, right? The daily exchange, right, of Eros. And that's the circle quality of the feminine. So there's a quality of living which is not commodified, and it's not measured, and it's not lowest common denominator impulse, right? It's the quality of the beingness when you sit with friends over a glass of wine, right? And the utter joy of being together, right? And, you know, and the joy of having this conversation with you, right? It has both a line quality. We're trying to enact Dharma, just a circle quality, right? This new figure that I didn't know a year ago that my friend Daniel introduced me to, named Andrew Sweeney, and I get to talk to him. What a delight. And we get to, right, to be in this deep conversation. It's conversation for its own sake. It's lishma. It's for its own sake. So that quality of the feminine needs to be restored in order to enact not the temple of Ahriman, but the temple of Solomon, right? And the temple of Solomon is about the immeasurable. And maybe I'll close with this Dharma on my side, and maybe we'll chant and sing to close, but there's a very beautiful set of texts, right, in the Aramaic Hebrew texts in the Talmud, which talk about the measurements of the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies in the temple has very precise measurements, right? And then there are artifacts in the Holy of Holies. There's an ark, you know, there's cherubs, right? So if you actually do the mathematics of the temple, it turns out that the measurements of what's in the temple don't match the measurements of the temple, right? Mm-hmm. You're like, hello, right? That's a major topic for 2,000 years of both mystical and Talmudic conversation. And the point is that measurement can't be measured, right? The point is there's a mystery, right? And, you know, sometimes when we love each other madly, we can make room, right? You know, maybe we finish with a story. There's a very famous story that my mother used to tell me, which is the one Hasidic story that she kind of knew. And it's a beautiful story that I'm sure some of you have heard, but it's originally a Hasidic story where the man comes to the master, the rabbi, and he says, my house is too crowded. I've got like 6 kids and my wife, and, you know, it's a very small house. And he says, oh, add a sheep. He says, add a sheep. I just told you it was crowded. He says, add a sheep. He adds a sheep. He comes to the rabbi a week later and he says, my house is so crazy crowded. He says, oh, got to bring in 2 dogs. Just bringing 2 dogs, you're out of your mind, right? He just brings in 2 dogs. And then he adds a cat, and then he adds a goat, right? And it's, you know, so finally it's like 11 weeks later, he says, Rabbi, what am I going to do? Gewalt geschrigen. He says, oh, just get rid of the sheep and the dog and the goats and all that. So he gets rid of all those added things. Oh, I've got so much room, right? You know, but it's the point of the story. It's actually this kind of funny story. We hide in laughter a very deep Dharma. And the Dharma is the play with measurement. If we love each other more, there'll be more room, right? It's so deep, right? If we love each other more, there'll be more room, right? When there's love, right, then the Shekhinah, right, she dwells in that space between the cherubs and the Holy of Holies. And if we don't love each other, there's not room at all. So let's love each other more and let's make more room, you know, like that.
Very nice.
Sure.
Very nice. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Mm. How about we do like this, my friend? Okay, because we want to close with your voice and your song. And we're kind of at I know we're over time, so I'm going to do maybe like a little short chant, and then just we'll go into the silence, and you pick it up in the Love or Die song. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay. It's not a chant which has a melody. It's actually a declaration. It doesn't follow the melody. It's just one declaration, which is about the joy of being and living in the temple. So it's not even a chant. So I'll just this is a short declaration, and we'll go into silence, and then Andrew will pick up. And thank everyone for being here. Like, oh my God, what a crazy honor and delight. And this is from David, and David gives this lineage transmission of this chant, these words, right, to Solomon. Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Jalalucha O Jalalucha Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Jalalucha O Jalalucha. And Solomon sang this about being in the temple. Hey Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Jalalucha O Jalalucha. 3 more times if anyone wants to join. Hey Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Jalalucha O Hallelujah to Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Hallelujah O Hallelujah Hey Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha O Hallelujah O Hallelujah.
All right. Well, this song, Mark gave me the chorus, Love or Die, and I think our first conversation, maybe our second. And it's sort of, to tie this to Mark's language and Mark's expression, I would say it's a celebration of the broken and the holy, the upside down and the beautiful, the mess, the horror and the beauty and all that. It's sort of a juxtaposition of all those things. And I try to, let's say, raise a glass just as an affirmation to these things, and then talk about this sort of choice we have in every moment, to be here or not. So anyway, I hope you can follow along with the words, and I hope it sounds okay over the internet. But I think I'm going to play it a little slower than I usually do, be a bit more soulful about it. So let's go. Does it sound okay? Does the guitar all sound all right? Can you hear it? Raise your glass to the ass, to the tongue-tied angel, and drink to the evil one and the supernal goodness, to the innocent babes, all armed to the teeth, to Saint Sebastian and his best friend, Zarathustra. Drink to the lovebirds, a drink to the wounded, a drink to the SRC and the Bitcoin babies, to Saturn and Mars, to a spurious infinity, a drink to the Empress out on the boiling sea. A drink for the phoenix of the divine attributes, a drink for the circle without center or periphery, a drink for the hell beings, for the lonely and the ugly, the hangman and the diplomat, for God and his monkey. A drink for the tourist, for the whore and the politician, a drink to the hungry ghost and to the jealous titans, and to the women in leather and the men who make thunder, and to the torso and the burning wheel and the naked becoming. Love, love or die, love or die, 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 love, love or die, love or die, da 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 da, love or die. A drink to the propaganda and the fancy undergarments, to Stalin's eyeballs and imperial ambitions, to shopping and football and foreign investment, to communism and the Eurovision love parade. Raise a glass to the losers and the society darlings, and the beauty of nothing and the ache of the body, to billionaires and those with nothing at all, and to the puppets and prisoners lined up against the wall. Raise your glass to the mast and to the sirens out, laughter to the outraged and the cancelled and the media slaughter, to the cherubim on the temple, to the dark machine rain, to broken wine vessel, to blessed drunkenness. Raise your glass to Ukraine, the violated country. May you be whole again, may you be there. And to David and Goliath, and to some tender bullet, to the yellow and the violet.
Perfect, perfect.
You gotta love, love or die, love or die, da die, da die, da die, da die. Love or die. There you go.
Not a place to clap, not a place to clap, just to bow. To bow. Yeah, gorgeous. Gorgeous, Andrew, it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. We're actually it's gorgeous, gorgeous. We're we want to create a kind of album, you know, of kind of the vision, kind of a love or die album. So it'd be great to record this on the album, wouldn't it? It'd be fantastic. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
What a delight to be with everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Till next month. Right? Oh my God. Oh my God. Yay.